Two masters of the mixed immersive arts join us today. These fellows create multi-layered immersives in New York City that fuse gameplay, reactive narrative, and infinite endings. They are the intersection between acting prowess and game design. I give you Ian Mckneely and Austen Anderson of Broken Ghost Immersives.
There, it feels like a real physical flesh and blood memory, and it was an immersive experience. So, it's gonna get wild.
Maybe it's about coming into relation with one another and with ourselves.
It's not about winning or who can be the most organized, but kind of like who can enjoy the mess the most or who's ready to play.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Sky, the host of the Immersion Nation podcast. Here, the masters of immersive experience create and conjure, muse, and imagine the cultural revolution that is unfolding before us. That is immersive entertainment. Welcome.
Ian, Austen, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time.
We are excited too. We can't wait to talk a little bit about immersive performance.
And all the immersive things.
All the immersive things out there.
All right, so to start off with a relatively simple question, I do have to ask, what immersive world, or what fantasy world, what fictional world, I should say, would you guys live in?
This is an easy one. I would go to Star Trek because it's a world that has evolved beyond material possessions. Everyone lives a happy, productive, fulfilled life, their best version of themselves. Star Trek all the way.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Darn, I'm gonna be in the tank and die. If you're I'm gonna do left of center. I'm gonna say I'd go to the Farscape world. I'll take your spaceship idea and double down.
Okay.
Not because it's gonna be a more comfortable life, but I guess like if I'm gonna get weird in a fantasy world, I'm gonna get weird. Let's get weird.
Where would you go? Where would you go in the Farscape world, Austin? That's a very specific choice.
It's a choice I made without thinking about that wonderful question you asked me. I want to be on a spaceship and explore, right? Like if you're going to go into Spaceland, I want to kind of get the buffet, the sampler pass.
Yeah,
Cool.
Of course. That makes a whole lot of sense.
The truth of that answer is that I would probably die rapidly. But it'd be good while it lasted, maybe.
That's the trick with the question too, because so many of the lovely fantasy worlds out there are driven by very torrid conflict, and so like the Star Trek answer is definitely one that I like. Is like actually for the most part, things in the Star Trek universe are relatively okay.
Yeah, it's one of the few universes that isn't defined by how it murders people.
Yeah, that's the truth. So for those who aren't familiar, could you tell us a little bit about your guys' path to immersion, specifically to the format that you guys are working with presently?
Well, we actually studied performance together, acting, but specifically like Shakespearean acting in undergrad. And maybe that's part of the reason why I love the Star Trek world, because it's so painfully Shakespearean. But that's kind of where we developed our love of language, our love of story that unfolds in sort of a theatrical way, as opposed to other mediums that are more based in things like dance or spectacle and atmosphere. I think ours is very much tempered in language and talking. And also we're both just big gamers. We love role-playing games. We used to play at our apartment in college and after college, role-playing games, and those two seem to have sort of a natural relationship.
Yeah, quite a bit. I think that's entirely fair. I feel like a lot of the world of immersion has come from some form of gaming, because that game format is, I feel like, the easiest and one of the most fun ways to engage with interactive experience.
What about you, Austin? What was your path to get here?
I mean, you said we. I was hoping that I would get a ride on your coattails. Yeah, I'll keep going from what you said. We went to college together. After college, we continued that love of Shakespeare. We formed a Shakespeare company. Did that for a while, and then both kind of scattered off into the winds to do professional theater and get master's degrees in various disciplines. Mm-hmm. And we came back together and started kind of saying, we love games. We love storytelling. We love theatrical storytelling. It might be kind of nice if we had a play that was like a game. And we had read about other things that were happening in that sphere. And we just started trying stuff. We just we did one summer where we just had no real goal except to experiment and come up with different experiences. And that was a ton of fun.
Oh, yeah.
And from there, I moved back to the West Coast, and Ian was in New York, and he started putting on shows. And I started coming up with ways I could perform in them that was remote. Mm-hmm. And those two avenues kept being fun and fruitful, and we kept going in that direction.
Yeah, it's funny. At first, I thought that would be sort of a detriment, right, to try to incorporate a remote performer. But I think it ended up being one of our real signature pieces. Every single thing we make has an interesting component with someone that's not there physically, but is controlling the event to some degree or performing at the event to some degree remotely. And of course, that's Austen. Austen is the performer.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that you kind of speaking on your guys' mutual love of language and literature also could be interpreted as kind of a manifestation there, because I feel like you guys leverage language and that type of thing within the event or within the experience more than is standard, more than one that, say has all actors there. You guys have the iPads, you guys have these different things that are written out in that format that definitely is conducive to a very multifaceted kind of thing, which is really, really interesting to see. I feel like in many ways, or at least I would hope that, say, the escape room industry could start to take some cues, because I think there's a lot more to do there with people being engaged in the experience and not just the environment, engaged socially, engaged on a multitude of levels.
It's interesting you bring that up. Oh, sorry. What were you going to say, Austin?
No, yours sounds like it's more of a well-formed thought. Go for it.
Well, in New York, I was actually just at a gathering last night of many escape room creators and aficionados, people that are just really into escape rooms and the state of the industry. And cool. In New York, they're having a long, dark midnight of the soul because the fire marshals came in response to the terrible tragedy in Poland, and they've shut down, I think, maybe half of the escape rooms here, and they are being reopened very slowly until some painfully draconian and arbitrary rules are met. But in the meantime, all these owners and creative users are really thirsty for the thing they love, for these escape rooms. And it's a point to sort of, I don't know, reflect on the state of the industry and where it's going. But that's an open-ended question about what is this going to be? What do we want it to be? And I think traditionally there's been the escape room paradigm where people it's interactive and they're engaged meaningfully, and but it's maybe light on story. And conversely, there's like the Sleep No More atmospheric world that's high into immersion, but very low on interaction. These are your only real agency is where do you want to stand? What do you want to follow?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, and to get back to language, I saw this interview, or I heard it. I read it or heard it. I can't remember. I've been trying to find it for a couple of weeks now because it keeps coming back into my head. But it was with one of the creators of Sleep No More. And they said, we did so many different immersives where we tried to have the performers speak, and it never worked. It always felt wrong and disingenuous. And we don't do speaking things like that because of that. And I thought that was interesting because we've gone the opposite direction, where we try to talk as much as we can, and the whole thing is about talking and interacting. And and I mean, Sleep No More is fantastic. So it's not a who's right, who's wrong. It's just interesting that you could come to two very different conclusions or go in two very different directions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Huh. I had not heard that, but it is like, especially my personal feelings on immersion is I am a really, really big appreciator of social immersion. I feel like social immersion can do a lot of different things that environmental, or at least only environmental or non-interactive, can. To say reference the tension experience, for instance. I mean, yeah, of course, their sets and their whole setup was huge and incredible and ridiculous. But there was that kind of psychological social dynamic that was able to drive that experience and, drives your guys' experience. And of course, you have the different characters and different bunkers that are playing very different roles, but at the same time, people kind of form relationships with, which, I mean, you have to wonder if that even would have been possible, pre readily available just smartphone era. I mean, even if you had IM where people adjusted enough to kind of having that emotional discourse within a digital space.
Well, I do think most of our users are in their 30s or maybe 40s, and that's kind of a generation of people that grew up on instant messenger. At least I did. I spent a lot of hours on IM. Mm-hmm. So there's something very familiar. It's like going home to get on a tablet and start typing to somebody.
Yeah, just having the ability to communicate through text that quickly, right? I mean, I don't know about your parents, but when I send my parents a text, the thing that I receive back is generally barely English and a cipher to look through, and it takes a little while. And so, yeah, I don't know if a couple of years ago people would just have that shorthand for, I type with two thumbs and I hold the device in my hand. And it's a perfectly normal way for me to converse with somebody else. And it feels normal and connected.
Right. And of course, I believe I heard an anecdote. I think this was on your No Pro interview about someone like spending some time flirting with one of the characters and then their parents being in the bunker or something like that, which I thought was incredibly funny. I know it might not have been as much so to be inside of that particular social encounter in real life, but that's
I don't know. It was very funny. I think inside and out, that was hilarious. But again, and that speaks to what you said before, where I think a lot of people, that's how they interact romantically too, right? You're on dating apps and your initial, really your first date is talking through text with people, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I don't use dating apps. I'm married. Can either of you? Am I way off base there, or is that true?
Yeah. Some awkward texting. Right? That's how it always starts.
Yeah.
I think that there's quite a bit of truth to that, and I think that there's definitely going to be more and more truth to that as younger people start to engage in the immersive world, because that is so much more their world than it was ours, having come from, being used to email and instant messaging, whereas they, have that is the social staple from my understanding. And I don't know too much of how they the teenagers do the things, but I know that is definitely a much more significant component.
Let me tell you, it's gonna get wilder. I was just watching a video that's been making the rounds on the internet of a pastor inside VR chat, where you have an avatar and it's like the Matrix. You're in a VR headset talking to other cartoon looking characters, and they were doing a baptism. And this pastor took this anime avatar and dunked her head under virtual water in the Mario world, and they had a whole thing. So it's gonna get wild.
Wow,
I don't know how to feel about that. I would almost think that we are antithetical to that, because I'm not a church-going dude, but if there was something I admire about church and the institution, it's that a bunch of people have to get together in a space and share a social event that is all about dynamic proximity and what people think and feel and believe. And we, even though we're not a religious thing, we still have people in religion or in dynamic proximity, and they're talking to each other and about the things they care about. Except in ours, it's like, how are we going to survive this horrible bunker? But I wonder if you lose the thing that makes coming together powerful if it's not in a physical space.
I mean, you have to some degree. And I think that's a really, really interesting conversation for the world of immersion overall, because it comes down to this idea that immersion has, especially social immersion, of all forms and shapes, creates this really interesting dynamic that connects people in a way that I think is incredibly unique, and I think has a lot of potential for our culture that does tend to become increasingly more isolated in many ways. And I think immersion has a lot of potential to kind of maybe provide some variety of antidote for that. But at the same time, once you start introducing the VR and AR side of that, it's a very curious question.
It's really interesting because when you look up immersive or immersion or immersives or immersion, you get those two extremes. You get 12 people in a tiny room together having this very dynamic, very personal social interaction, but the same groups who talk about those immersive experiences often are keyed into VR and AR, which are almost, in some ways, are the opposite. I don't know. I might not be as extreme as Ian, because I kind of feel like I see how that circle loops back around. Like, I see how there still is this dynamic feeling because you're interacting with a person, right, compared to a video game where I'm interacting with, code and things like that. But that's very interesting that those two things seem so far apart, yet kind of keep bumping into each other in similar ways.
Yeah. And okay, so we do have to move on to our little game segment, Make It Immersive, in a second here, but I do have to ask, as someone who has spent a decent amount of time within the escape room industry, in particular one that actually had room monitors in the room as opposed to remote, and monitoring through a camera, it was always an adventure to kind of work with the groups and try and get them to become cohesive. What has that experience been like for you guys, especially bringing together groups of people who don't necessarily know each other?
Well, I think because there is such a varied composition to any given audience, sometimes they're one whole group that are like a birthday party. Sometimes it's a bunch of singletons or couples. Because there's so much variety, onboarding is really key. And of course, in all of these immersive performances, onboarding is always incredibly key because no one ever really knows what they bought a ticket to until they do the thing. And so to answer your question, I think you have to go piece by piece, really in a really linear fashion, and kind of hold people's hands so that maybe a good metaphor is like you can get the plane into the air. You got to go through the takeoff, and that involves teaching people the rules, the social contract, what's appropriate, what's not.
Right.
And just making them feel comfortable. Because if people understand what's happening, then they can focus on playing and cohesion and coming together, or, competition. Some groups are more interested in being in conflict, and that can be fun too, as long as there's enough of a boundary that people understand to play around.
Yeah. And I always found that the groups that just over communicated typically wound up doing the best. Like, I think one of the fastest groups I ever watched go through a room in that context was a group of call center reps, which I thought was hilarious. Like, having professors, having military, having police going through these rooms. And it's a group of call center reps that just does incredibly well.
That doesn't surprise me for a second. I bet those guys can get to the point faster than anybody.
Right.
It's interesting, though, because we were just talking about this after our last performance of the bunker. The way the bunker has ended up being set up, those communication groups sometimes have a little bit of a hard time because they're so they're so interested in gathering information, and the bunker is kind of an event that asks you at some point to make a choice and then enjoy the fallout of your choice.
Right.
And so sometimes those groups end up having a hard time sticking the landing, or at least from my perspective as the person who has to craft the ending, I have a harder time sometimes finding the really exciting threads in those groups because they're so meticulous. Whereas a really sloppy group where someone makes a wild choice that only half the room knows about, those endings are great. Those are always fireworks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So yeah, it's interesting how we're like dissimilar from other events in that way, where it's not about winning or who can be the most organized, but kind of like who can enjoy the mess the most or who's ready to play.
Yeah. And you guys have a narrative that is so not finite that it really just can only be about the storyline and the interplay of the characters within, which once again, I think is something that has not cropped up all that much throughout the world of immersion as of yet. And I think it's fascinating. I think it's really, really fascinating. All right, so to move on to make it immersive. I think that we should probably start with Farscape, of course.
Okay.
So what do you think? There's that exploration aspect that you had brought up earlier. How do you think that could be executed on?
Okay, great. I know where this starts. And then, Austen, you can help me develop this initial pitch. It's got to be on a Leviathan, right? We've got to be trapped on the living ship.
Of course.
Yeah.
That's the signature of the show.
Yeah, you got to stick that landing.
And I would assume, like any good story, it starts off with a huge problem. What do you think it should be, guys? What's the huge problem we encounter right off the bat?
Yeah. If it's a Farscape problem, I gotta think that the problem has to be something that's gonna put people at odds with each other. Because really, like that show, in my mind, the essence of it was always arguing with people you barely liked.
Right. And so you're starting with this kind of a competitive dynamic right off the bat, or at least potentially, unless you make that source of social conflict an external thing.
Yeah, some sort of conflict where you're putting people at odds against each other.
So maybe what was the terrible space empire? That Australian guy with the ponytail was chasing them.
Oh, the peacekeepers.
Thank you, nicely done. So the peacekeepers are coming. They're going to show up in a half an hour, and we all have to decide where we're going to take the Leviathan. Maybe.
Right. No, I got my pitch. I got one. The peacekeeper, you're on your Leviathan, and the peacekeepers show up. Man, I had no idea we were going to segue into Farscape fan fiction, or I would have been even more excited about this. But the peacekeepers show up, and they send a message to your ship and say, one of the members in there is a terrible fugitive, and we don't know who they are, and you must send them out to us within the next hour, or we'll kill everybody.
Oh, yeah, getting to a bit of a kind of werewolf/mafia format there.
Yeah, that feels very Farscapey to me.
And Austen, you could play the guy on the incoming screen where you show up and it's your head talking.
I'd have like some strange New Zealand accent. Hello, Leviathan ship. We heard you've got a fugitive aboard. That was
so happy that was preserved.
That was so many accents. I apologize to all of English-speaking Earth besides America.
The ponytail had an epic dialect. Every time he said the other ship, the baby ship's name, Tialan.
Yeah.
So these guys are going to kill everybody unless you can surrender the traitor who is on board this ship. That's great.
I like that. I think that has the bones right there. And you guys both definitely have me wanting to go back and rewatch Farscape because it's been far too long, apparently. So then if we could briefly touch on Star Trek, if we're going for a conflict angle on the Farscape thing, my head goes to diplomacy, though, of course, there are many other formats that Star Trek has been explored in over the years.
Well, if we're going to talk about Star Trek, then I better throw down the gauntlet. The thing that always made Star Trek the best show ever, my favorite sci-fi growing up, was that it had that dramatic quality of a Shakespeare play. The central vehicle for solving their problems, like you say, diplomacy, I think it's talking. It's self-reflection and philosophical. And, this is why every single episode Picard is struggling with issues like the Prime Directive, right? We have to wrestle with our own morality, and we do language to think through these problems. So maybe this would be a problem where this is a classic TNG episode where there's like 4 different ships from 4 different empires all around a primitive planet. And one of them is going to blow it up unless they get the artifact off the surface. And another one wants to infiltrate it with spies, like the Romulans would be doing that. And then we have to figure out a way to preserve the locals and be fair while still, getting the artifact or whatever we're here to do.
I mean, the artifact has extreme cultural importance to these people. We have to find a way to preserve it on their
he's
planet.
An archaeologist. I love it. I love it. It's such a progressive value system.
And of course, then the trick is not to, dismantle or disarm said enemies. You have to convince them to walk away permanently, which is a whole different challenge.
Yeah, you have to relate meaningfully to them. So this would be a totally different, you wouldn't be in your fighter spaceships shooting at each other. You'd have to use your words.
Now that could be interesting. Just leaning super heavily on the audience for that emotional journey there. I feel like it would be super tricky to execute because that onboarding would be intensive.
When I show up in the transporter room with my makeup on, my blue Andorian makeup, it'll all come together. That's the secret. That's the immersive hook.
I had some friends go to an immersive kind of play event. It was at a theater in Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
And so this is me remembering it secondhand. I didn't go, but essentially the conceit was that they had a big pile of money, and maybe it was the ticket fees were put into a bucket, and the audience had to decide what best to do with that money by the end of the night.
What did they pick?
Oh, that's interesting.
I think ultimately it was an underwhelming experience, and I remember my friends not being very happy. But that kind of general conceit seemed very Star Trekky to me, right? Like you have to make this really civilized, highly progressive choice of how do we function as a community and a society? What are our values? What are we, aspiring to do? And work through it in a really granular way.
Yeah, and then I feel like building it out, that process would be almost a little bit easier because, there are studies around that kind of social space, those kind of social phenomena that come up, and, all the way through game theory, you would be able to kind of build it off of that as a structure, and then, put people into it, see how they interacted. And of course that of course in my head ties to the bunker because naturally reminiscent to Fallout. Sorry, I hope you guys don't mind that comparison.
No, it's so funny. I've actually never played Fallout. Really? At first it was just sort of random, and then once I realized that I was making something that was so incredibly adjacent to it, I deliberately siloed myself because now I'm worried I'll contaminate my process a little bit.
Ha. No, that's entirely fair. That's entirely fair.
Some stuff is.
But I've played a lot of Fallout, so I cross-contaminate you all the time. Or there's been many times when you've had an idea and I've gone, that's Fallout. And you're
that's
like,
okay.
oh,
That's fine. That's fine. No one ever thinks up things for the first time. We're always stumbling into other people's trails, I think.
Naturally. That's where all the good things come from. All right, so do you guys potentially be ready to move on to a few rapid fire questions?
Yes.
Very ready.
Excellent. All right, so what is one of an immersive experience that you are particularly excited about the potential of, even if it's not the present form that it's in, something that is poking at a new frontier of some variety?
Mega games. I think mega games are an incredibly, the proposition is so great. We're going to put hundreds of people in a room and we're all going to work in real time, like the butterfly effect, where things can just make echoes and waves around this giant group of people. But It's got a long way to go. I think it's the hardest thing to design because it's the hardest form medium to playtest. So we iterate over and over again with groups of 15. They need hundreds of people, or at least dozens. So it's very nascent. It is beginning, and I want to see where that goes.
That's a great answer. I'll say that my answer is that I'm really excited about, and not surprising, but the interactive events that happen over your browser, where you're talking to someone else through a camera with a microphone. I've read about a couple. They're kind of just starting, but there's so much potential there to have these really intimate, performative experiences while you're sitting in your office or your bedroom or wherever you are.
Yeah, I feel like that one's definitely been a hanging question mark for a while, because there is that, hey, how much emotional context can you have via that digital medium? And then mega games, I've actually not heard of that, which tells me that I am not doing due diligence in that area, and I definitely have some research to do. That sounds
Watch
incredible.
the Skies is the most well-known one, the one that kind of put it on the map. There's a what's the YouTube guys?
Shut up and sit down.
Thank you. They do a great one. There's a game in the UK with like 250 people in a community center, and it's the United Nations, and aliens show up. There's a team of aliens. The Pope is a playable character.
Oh, okay.
It's just like the systems.
Definitely going to spend some time.
Great, you'll love it.
It's interesting because that's from the board game world. So if you only look at immersive stuff, you might miss it if you don't like playing board games.
I have done a ridiculous amount of board games. I grew up in a house that was like literally the walls were only board games, but I unfortunately have not played nearly as much in the last few years. So coming back to Gen Con last year, if you guys are familiar, it's kind of my rechristening into that world.
That is so cool.
So what are a couple quick things that you do to get your audience engaged and immersed in the experience? I know we kind of touched on that generally before, but specifically, what do you find works with your format?
Well, from my experience, often you show up at these events that you don't understand and feel uncomfortable, and maybe you don't know people there, or you don't know very many people there. So some things are kind of common sense, like in name tags, for example, really, really helpful. Mm-hmm. This sounds kind of silly, but we have a fridge full of beer at the bunker, and anyone who wants is welcome to just have beer. And there's not like, I don't know, a bartender watching it. The point is that it's like you walked into someone's living room and it's got a casual vibe, and you set people at ease.
Yeah.
I like to make sure that I do something a lot that I think of maybe as mirroring, or I think of David Mamet. This is going to sound super pretentious, I'm sorry, but David Mamet has this acting quote about invent nothing, deny nothing. Mm-hmm. And from my end, it works really well if you don't try to pretend that things aren't what they are. Like if someone's asking you about this or that, you answer them honestly. And that, I think, helps people really engage with digital characters or immersive actors, or just trying to be present with them. And if they want to go in a certain direction, being free to follow that thread and not feel like you have to always railroad them to, yeah, that's interesting, but my name is John and my backstory is this. And I went,
halfway through.
It's not Wikipedia the character. It's like, you know what? If I don't ever even get to my lines, that's probably going to be the most engaged interaction of the evening.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's definitely why social immersion is so tricky to pull off, because, I mean, even coming out of just like traditional theater community, I know that not a whole lot, or at least not all of actors are super familiar with improv, and that's definitely a lot of that yes and mentality there.
Well, that's a real skill, isn't it? Everybody thinks they can do that, and then somebody says something you don't like, and it's really hard to be like, oh, okay, I accept what you just said. But you have to do it. There's no alternative, because the minute you're in a space where performers are sort of nipping people's creativity in the bud, the war is over. We've lost.
Yeah. And it's like the credibility of the people who are guiding the audience to the experience is, I don't want to say damaged, but like the perception of the director, orchestrator, DM, what have you, it's shifted. It's like they walk out of the immersion real quick and leave the audience. It's like, hey, what happened? So what kind of impact do you think that immersive theater will have on traditional theater and theater as a whole?
Well, I mean, if I were being honest, I don't think theater is in a very healthy state right now. And I mean, it's patroned by people almost exclusively in their later years. Young people aren't drawn to it. And there's no wonder that young people aren't drawn to it, because they're just sort of rehashing the same plays in the regions over and over again in this sort of like, just add water and you have an instant play, right? The script is the thing and they can sort of franchise it. Or conversely on Broadway, it's just these tourist trap plays. So it's not exactly my cup of tea. But then again, I'm a person like many people my age that grew up stimulated, who needs to interact. I need to be busy. I can't just, if I'm going to sit and watch a play, that play better be really engaging or I'm going to start to lose focus. So I think that's the direction.
I had
that's the direction. Sorry. I think it'll go. What were you going to say, Austen? I'm sorry.
I had a thought the other day, and I was thinking, some regional theater, some large, well-known regional theater is going to have some semi-immersive event spark. They're going to have a hit. They're going to get a good review. It's going to create a bunch of buzz in American Theater Magazine. And I am really looking forward to then watching all of these theaters start to chase their tails, trying to figure out how to make immersive events. Because I worked at a theater for a while, and I worked actually in the script department. So I would see incoming scripts, and we got 2 or 3 like semi-immersive or like multi-room plays, but they were not equipped to even begin looking at scripts like that. So I think there will be an influence, but I think that the structure of those regional theaters is going to be really ill-equipped to deal with it in any way at all. And I will be very curious to see how all that shakes down.
It could be good for us, though. I mean, I would love to go help. I know the Denver Center is making a big investment in trying to figure out how to transition, like, to build that infrastructure you're talking about, to build that way of thinking. And
I shouldn't be too. There are some theaters who are thinking smartly. Denver Center, Woolly Mammoth in DC has done some like pre-show immersive audience engagement stuff that has been really cool, but one of them is going to get big, and then it's going to be interesting to see.
In the meantime, a lot of them are poaching high-profile companies from places like New York and London to come in and do their own shows produced by places like the Denver Center, which is an interesting model too. I don't know. It's always interesting to me how New York collaborates with the regions, because geography is keeps us apart, and yet we're all a part of the same American theater community. It'd be nice to have more connections like that. They were producing something by Third Rail, I think, at the Denver Center recently. Am I making this up? Did you hear about this, Austen?
That sounds vaguely
I was really
familiar.
excited, but of course I'm not in Denver, so what are you going to do?
I might be wrong, but it might not be the Denver Center. I can't remember the exact location off the top at the moment, but I know that Capital W is doing something in Denver as well. So it might have been that, but that might have been separate.
It makes sense, though, right? People in New York get stuck in New York-centric worldview, and it'd be very easy for organizations and other places to pick them up and plant them in their communities.
And I do kind of wonder if we're going to see something that we've seen a lot in many other areas, being just there being a much lower barrier to entry to acting, to acting insofar as live acting, because for so long that had this kind of, the very, I don't know, the almost rock star dynamic where everybody's trying to get to, some of the same places. And this is, albeit speaking as someone who is on the outside, just as this is the outside perception of it. And, actually surviving as a professional actor, I think for a long time has definitely been very tricky. Whereas with the potential proliferation of immersive experiences, like, oh, hey, suddenly does this open the gates to a degree, and suddenly this just becomes a much larger part of our culture once again?
I hope so. That'd be pretty cool.
Fingers remain crossed, certainly. And I think what is looking like the final question of our rapid fire round here is, what do you think is the most, or one of the most important things that participants take away from an immersive experience?
That's a great question. We should have a much faster answer for that.
Well, I was talking to somebody last night who'd come to the bunker, and it's kind of funny because at the time, I don't know if they had an incredible experience, but he was telling me that he had taken away the ending to heart, that they'd had this unique epilogue based on the choices he made, and because of that, he had rehashed those choices and decisions over and over again. So maybe like our Star Trek train of thought, he had been forced to wrestle with his values and his impulses around a subjective question, and he was still working through it. So maybe it's about coming into relation with one another and with ourselves.
Interesting. And I like that it's like you say that he might not have had like the most like mind-boggling experience in there or something that effect, but one way or the other, the fact that he still walked away from it and it was still personal enough that it didn't leave his mind. It just stayed
a year later. Yeah, it's been a year since he saw the bunker. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. That stickiness. The other day I had this memory of walking through this forest. And I'm like, where was I? When was I walking through that forest? Thought about it for a moment. It was Skyrim.
Oh, interesting.
And I have a couple memories like that where I felt like I was there. It feels like a real physical flesh and blood memory. And it was an immersive experience, or it was a play, or it was a video game. And so I kind of think that's to my mind, like that's what you're shooting for, right? Can you create these visceral, real, powerful memories, these experiences that kind of sink into you? Because those are pretty cool, and that's immersive, right? Like being somewhere you're not.
Yeah,
that's immersion.
Especially in your memory, in your recording of it not registering initially as something that was, artificially created, something that registered as one way or the other. You were there having that real emotional, visceral experience that the context of then kind of gets lost in the shuffle of one's memories, and that emotional anchor stays.
Yeah, you stimulate the imagination so much that it takes over the other senses, and now that's the memory, not what was actually happening.
Oh, I love that. So as we wrap up here, is there anything that you would like to ask of or recommend to our audience as they are listening to the Immersion Nation podcast here by any chance?
Well, we have a whole summer full of awesome shows here in New York that we'd love to invite the audience to. We have The Bunker, which is a regular show at Wildrance, our space on the Lower East Side of New York. They're an event space we partner with that puts on some really exciting work. So we've got The Bunker on June 4th and 11th, and then 4 more dates in the end of July, beginning of August, and also the Rogues Gallery, which we haven't had a big chance to talk about today, but it's also very exciting. It's a supervillain convention where the guests at this event get to become supervillains and work to take over the world. And that's also at the end of July, beginning of August in Rep with The Bunker.
Yes. I know we did not get the chance to touch on that all too much, but I am incredibly excited to hear some more about that from you guys at some point in time. Another example of a really dynamic and unique kind of social immersion that I think is kind of new at this point in time, entirely new potentially.
Oh, it's a blast. And it feels like a party with a story and a game that you can interact with meaningfully. And if anybody's in the city, feel free to come check them out. They're so much fun. And also reach out to me personally, brokenghostimmersives@gmail.com. I'm so interested in what people have to say, what they think, their questions. And I've got questions for you guys. So it is very much an open dialogue between the creators and the guests, because we're all creating it together in the moment.
And I'll do my hard plug as well. Those tickets for the Rogues Gallery in the Bunker can be found on wildrence.com, WILDRENCE.com. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm Austen EA, AUSTENEA. And sometimes I talk about immersive stuff, or sometimes I live tweet. I live tweeted a performance of the Bunker. That was a ton of fun. So I'm there.
Yeah, that takeover was actually really lovely to watch. It was cool to get a smidgelet of a bit more insight into the mechanics of the whole thing there. So thank you guys very much for doing that on Twitter, and of course the No Pro takeover there. So yeah.
Oh yeah, that was fun.
Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation, you guys. I very much appreciate both of you being willing and being able to take the time to be on the show. And of course, share some insights with myself and our audience.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you. This was fantastic.
You guys have a wonderful evening. And of course, everything that we discussed in the show can be found at immersionnation.com/podcast. And until next time, thank you for listening.
Calling all immersive adventurers, explorers, connoisseurs, and artists. The immersive revolution is just beginning. All that is to say, we would love any feedback that you might have on the show. What do you want to hear more of, less of? Anyone in particular you'd like us to have on the show? I would love to hear your thoughts, so please rate us, review us, or just drop us a line on the website at immersionnation.com. I always love having conversations about this wide and wild world that we are both living in and creating. Once again, this is the Immersion Nation podcast. Thank you for joining us in this adventure.